human dignity is something many of us take for granted. We naturally assume the worth and value of individuals. We do the same thing with human rights. We presuppose that these are universal principles that should be evident to everyone. We view things like slavery and human trafficking with the contempt and revulsion they rightly deserve. But things weren't always this way. Human beings have treated one another horribly in the past, and it is this kind of terrible treatment that Christianity seeks to prevent. We're going to look at one example provided by the highly regarded classical historian Tom Holland. During a 2019 debate with British philosopher and fellow atheist A.C. Grayling, Holland pointed out the connection between human dignity, sexuality, and Christianity, especially when it came to the lives of slaves in the Roman Empire. Now, there's one moment around the midway point where he uses some very frank sexual language, but please listen to his argument closely.
When Paul says that there is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no man or woman, the justification he offers for this is actually founded in the idea of slavery being set aside, that someone who suffered the death of a slave has triumphed over power, has triumphed over the kind of mastery that, in the classical sense, is the expression of the right to hold a slave. And I want to focus on one particular aspect, because I think that this is kind of very measurably influential on the way that we conceptualize things today, and that's the issue of sex.
Okay.
And so there's a common idea that Christian sexual morality is kind of, repressive, puritanical, boring, square, something that we have to jettison. And absolutely the idea that Paul is some kind of hung up guy who just turns up and, Greeks and Romans are all having great fun and orgies and stuff, and Paul turns up like the massive party pooper and ruins everyone's entertainment. But actually, the doctrine of sexuality that Paul preaches is deeply founded in his idea that slavery is something to be overcome, and that everybody has been liberated by the sacrifice of Christ. Because what he is saying is that every human being, by virtue of Christ's sacrifice and death, now has a value. And he specifically says that they have a bodily integrity, and that every man, every woman, every child has that their bodily sacrality is a reflection of, if in the case of a woman, of the church, and in the case of a man, of Christ himself. And so that's to give a dignity, say, to a household slave that he'd never been given before.
Because they could be used as sexual objects.
But absolutely, they were expected to be used as sexual objects. The Romans had the same word for urinate and ejaculate. And essentially, the mouths, the vaginas, the anuses of slaves were regarded as akin to urinals. These are objects in which bodily fluid can be ejected by the master. And that is their role, absolutely taken for granted. So the radicalism of Pauline and ultimately Christian teaching is to say, no, that isn't true. Everybody's body, no one has the right to have that done to them. And more importantly, that then means that there is an obligation on the male citizen, the master, the lord, to control his sexual appetites, because he is not allowed to do that. And so Paul's idea of lifelong matrimony as a kind of image of the marriage of Christ in the church embodies, it sets in train a radical reconfiguring of the way that people in what will emerge as Christian civilization come to think about sex and come to think about marriage. And I think by and large, pretty much everyone now takes those assumptions for granted. And we can see that. I mean, in the 60s in particular, there was this kind of sense that, Christian morality is boring, let's get rid of it, let's rip it up. Sexual revolution, let's go back to kind of the hedonism of pagan days, let's be Dionysic. Of course, the Greek god Dionysus was a rapist. All the Greek gods were regular rapists. It enshrined the idea that males had the right to use their inferiors in any way that they wanted. And that was something that essentially over the course of the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, we know what the consequence of that was. And we see that now with the Me Too movement, which essentially is an attempt to reimpose Christian sexual morality. And the paradox of this, and there are so many paradoxes that surround this, is that women who go on marches in support of Me Too will dress up in the costumes of handmaids from Margaret Atwood's novel and the TV adaptation of it. And that, of course, is written as a parody of Puritanism. Yet essentially what they are demanding is that men control themselves and essentially behave as Puritans. And the truth is that Me Too would only work, it would only have the resonance that it does if most men accepted the validity of what women protesters were saying. And I think that by and large they do. And I think that is, I mean, if that is not evidence of the saturating effect of Christian teaching over 2,000 years, I don't know what is.
To briefly sum up what Holland says here, it's that you can see human dignity, or the lack thereof, in how people are treated, especially when it comes to sexuality. Roman masters could use their slaves as sexual objects, but the Christian view of humanity and sexuality teaches that this is absolutely abominable. In fact, this underlies our modern view of sexuality and personal dignity. Unlike the ancient Romans, Christianity denies that a person can be used or viewed as a sexual object. It also denies that people can be treated as inferiors. It affirms that human beings are important enough that they have the right to expect loyalty and devotion from their marriage partners. While many people see Christian views of sexuality as oppressive and repressive, this is only the case in a world saturated by Christianity. In antiquity, this view of sexuality was not repressive, it was actually liberating. It meant that men were required to control themselves. It meant that women could not be violated against their will, and it also meant that slaves could not be regarded purely as sexual objects. In fact, I would argue that most people today believe these things to be true, but it's only because of the influence of Christianity. If you were to say these things, any of these things, in ancient Rome or Greece, your listeners would laugh at you. Honestly, it's sort of a sad story that the people who campaign against Christian morality must presuppose it in order to condemn it.